What's going on, everyone? It is time to do a little bit of retrospection and review some of the cards that have either extremely overperformed or underperformed based on either my own opinion or just in general what the community thought at the time of spoiler season. Now, I'll say this set has had two iterations where if you had done this list or talked about cards, leaders, etc. in the first month of release, it would be way different than the list today because the meta has changed so drastically. Granted, there are still some cards that have remained consistently in terms of their evaluation, but I decided to wait for a little while after the suspension because the game really has been really diverse over the course of that time. A big thank you to my patrons over on Patreon. Thank you for supporting the channel. And I got a TCG player link in the description down below if you want to pick up any of the better cards than we thought here in this video. And let's dive into our first one. First one we're going to talk about is Red Squadron Y-Wing. This is the 2-cost space unit in Aggression Heroism, 1/3 with the Rebel tag, which was exciting, and has the on attack to deal 3 indirect damage to defending player, making them have the ability to kind of spread that damage as they choose amongst their units and bases. This was pretty promising in the early spoiler season. As we had mentioned, it's a rebel unit. We could add one of the early plays in the 2-drop slot to some of our rebel aggro decks. The problem with this is it actually, although in some cases can hit for 4 or 3 damage, most often will hit for about 2 damage on attacks, and in the mid to late game is where it gets way worse. In the early game, the Y-Wing still performs decently well compared to some of the other options that you'll be playing in this slot, like the A-Wing and another A-Wing that got released in this set as well. Those ones usually are going to be attacking for 3, so you really want to at least get 3 damage in with the Red Squadron Y-Wing, and you usually do in the early game, especially if you're running Tarkentown with this. But as soon as you hit, turn 4s, 5s, etc., and you had the Y-Wing out, the damage on it just drops through the floor. And that's where the problem comes in, is that it doesn't actually provide all that much threat when you're not playing it directly on turn 1. And so because of that, it ended up being a card that most people are not playing when it's something that I thought, as well as a lot of others, were testing out and messing around with early on in the set and had promising results. The next one for me has got to be the Ghost. Now, this one's interesting because we don't really see this a whole lot in competitive play. It's not something that's super commonplace, but it is a card that is massively impressed. And anyone that has kind of dove into either your Hera decks or just trying to make the Spectre synergy work, this is one of those cards where it can really cause you the difference between winning and losing a game. Like, it will literally win the entire game for you in certain circumstances. Now, I've been playing around with this for set 5, and I do think the Ghost has a lot of potential there, even with more Spectre units, especially with the new Kanan leader. But even with set 4, you just have so many Spectre units now, and the ability to get it upgraded is relatively easy, and you still get a really nice body in a 5/6. But the key part is generating Sentinel for all of your other units. This can really help you stall out the game just enough to close out the game, because your opponent's got to hit your units where you're hitting their base, and you're going to outpace them in terms of kind of damage. And that's the key. It's really quite a solid card. If the whole Spectre tribe just had a little bit more, I could definitely see this being a core portion of one of the stronger decks in the game. Next up, we probably have the biggest flop of them all on this list, and that's got to be They Hate That Ship. Very interesting card, very comparable to something like a Now There Are Two of Them. We have the 1-cost event in Aggression Heroism. It's going to have an opponent to create 2 TIE Fighter tokens, ready them, and then you get to play a vehicle unit from your hand costing 3 less. So there's really 3 issues with this card that ended up making it basically unplayable. First off, it's a 1-cost event that gives you the 3 resource discount, but on something that doesn't actually have that many great 5 and 4 resource plays. And what I mean by that is, let's say you're playing this on turn 1, you could play a 4 resource space unit. On turn 2, a 5 resource space unit, which is really where the biggest effectiveness comes, right? Of course, later on, you have combinations like Home 1 or bigger space units, but there's just not enough power in the early game to really feel like you are getting massively ahead, especially when your opponent immediately gets to attack you. The second thing, and this really comes down to kind of where the meta was at beforehand and after. Obviously, before Django, your unit just got exhausted and it was just horrible. After Django, your opponents are just removing it with whatever removal they have because they have a ton of it. It's a super big mid-range format. And then your opponent's left with 2 TIE Fighter tokens. You kind of are pretty far down and you've used another card in your hand. And the last thing is it warps your deck. And this is the biggest thing probably is in order to play this card, you have to be playing these expensive space units that normally you wouldn't be playing outside of it. Whereas now there are 2 of them, for example, which is very comparable from set 3 or set 2 rather. You had like Cad Bane running it because you were playing Underworld cards, you were playing the 5-drop Underworld cards regardless, and you just had that synergy baked into it, and it was really powerful. This one really requires a lot of deck building to move around it in order to be good at all, and that ended up making it basically unplayable. Next one was definitely an underrated one, mainly because it just kind of flew under the radar, mostly more than, hey, this card is probably just unplayable. 3-cost ground unit, Guerilla Soldier, Cunning. It's a 2/3, so pretty horrible stat line, realistically. But you have this ability, when played, you deal 3 indirect damage to a player, and if they get a base hit in, you get to ready this guy immediately. Basically, how this plays out in a real game scenario, this is a 3 resource 2/3 that deals 2 to their base, immediately readies up, and then deals 1 to one of their units. Or even 3 to their base, and then you get to immediately ready this up. Or you've dealt multiple damage to their unit, and you get to finish it off with some of the other units that you have or effects. Obviously, with Tarkin Town, this becomes extremely oppressive because turn 2, you're dealing a couple damage here and there. It fits perfectly with Quinlan as well. So you deal damage to a unit, you get to finish on Tarkin Town. Maybe you play this, you deal damage with Quinlan, and now your opponent really can't take indirect damage to their units because otherwise their units will just die. And realistically, the way the math works out is when you have a 3-cost like 3/5, which is pretty average stat line, or a 3/4, if this, let's say, deals 1 damage to a base and you get an immediate readied up, well, if you think about how much effect that is, you get an immediate 3 damage in that turn. Your other 3-powered unit won't get to attack to turn 2. So now, or to the turn after. So then the turn after, you've dealt 5 damage with this attacking, whereas your other unit dealt 3. The next turn, you've dealt 7, whereas the other unit dealt 6, etc., etc. So the amount of time it takes for that 3-powered unit to actually outpace Guerilla Soldier is pretty intense. Now, of course, if your opponent removes this with one of their stronger units, like let's say they play a Battlefield Marine on turn 1 or whatever, and they just attack into it and they take the damage, that could be a little bit weaker. But generally speaking, when you're playing this card, you're playing it in a more tempo aggressive strategy, and that's where it fits perfectly, and your opponent doesn't have that option. So pretty impressive in Guerilla Soldier. No Glory Only Results is the next one. This is a 5-cost event in Vigilance Villainy. Take control of a non-leader unit and then you defeat it. This one's interesting because when I first saw this, I was like, yeah, this is going to be a very playable card. I am probably expecting it to see, 1 or 2 of in many, many Vigilance Villainy control decks and probably in the sideboard. And so you might think, oh, well, how is this even on the list? This thing has overperformed significantly to the point where most decks are just running the full 3 of baseline in their main deck all the time. And it makes sense, especially with what cards are being played in the meta. And it's super versatile. The biggest thing, of course, is that if you were to, let's say, play Vanquish in this slot, you would not be able to get around things like TIE Phantom. You would not be able to get around things like the Chewbacca. That dynamic of it is really, really impressive. We don't even see something like Lurking TIE Phantom in the meta really at all anymore because there's so many cards to actually go back and defeat it. Whereas when it was initially released, it was like, dang, I'm playing a control deck, I see a TIE Phantom, the game is basically over. That's kind of how it felt in the earlier sets because you had so minimal amount of opportunities to actually finish it off with the cards in your deck. No Glory Only Results gives you that option while also just being, as we said earlier, a Vanquish in most cases. It even gets better than that though because there are a lot of death triggers. Simply taking like a Super Laser Technician as an example, if you had a Vanquish, using it on a Super Laser Technician is like nightmare scenario. You've killed their Super Laser Technician, which is there to die anyways. they get to ramp you, use the card, use more resources than them. No Glory Only Results, on the other hand, you can take a Super Laser Technician, defeat it, and now becomes your resource, right? And then you have prevented them from ramping, and you've ramped yourself, which can sometimes change the nature of the entire game in certain matchups. And again, that's not a possibility with something like Vanquish. It applies to a lot of different scenarios. K2SO, things like Profundity as a bigger example. Any death trigger, you just get to absorb that trigger. And oftentimes that is a massive value swing for, in most cases, just an extra resource paid, because most people are playing takedowns and Fell the Dragons anyways. This one, you just put 1 or 3 copies in. Yes, it's an extra resource, but the value is significantly higher. Next up, we have Pantoran Starship Thief. This one's been pretty interesting, and I've tried to experiment with it, but I think the restriction on it is just a little bit too high. We have a 2-cost ground unit in command villainy. It's a 2/2, but when you play it, you may pay 3 resources. If you do, you can attach it as an upgrade to any fighter or transport as long as it doesn't have a pilot, and you get to take control of that unit. So essentially, the way this works is it's like a traitorous in that you play it on a unit and you take that unit. But instead of being traitorous' restriction of being a 3 or less cost unit, this is restricted to strictly fighter or transports that do not have a pilot on it. Now, what's interesting about this is if you look at kind of the fighter / transports that are being played, well, first off, transports, there's not a ton of them as compared to fighters, because transports or fighters are just really early on the curve and they just kind of spread out. But you do have a couple of key ones, including the Millennium Falcons. So Millennium Falcons, they're both transports, and that's going to be the most key ones for Pantoran Starship Thief. What's interesting about that is usually people are playing things like Chewbacca or Han Solo on those, so you can't actually steal them away because it has a pilot on it. So that already knocks them out. Even though there are transport opportunities, the transports that are most commonly being played usually are going to get a pilot on them in some way or another, which is a little bit unfortunate. But then if you also consider fighters, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot more of them and very, very common, but most of them are going to be cards that you're playing early on into the game. Think of like A-Wing, Red 5. You've got things like some of the TIE Fighters. You've got the Zygerian Starhoppers. All of those cards, guess what, can be just traitorous away. And so when you're looking at this card, you're like, okay, I could play Pantoran Starship Thief, but I can also play traitorous. And if my opponent's, let's say, not playing Space deck, then we can also steal ground units, which this thing cannot. So even though it's got higher upside in terms of, hey, I can steal something way bigger, like I can steal big units, usually the application is just a worse traitorous. Next up, we've got a very, very simple one. 4-cost event in Vigilance, direct hit. Defeat a non-leader vehicle unit. When I saw this card, similar to the No Glory Only Results, I was looking at it and I was like, yeah, I could definitely see this if vehicles are pretty popular. Seeing this as, a couple copies main deck and maybe a couple copies sideboard. Turns out, well, even when a lot more decks were playing very space-heavy decks, like Django, for example, this wasn't really a card you were playing. Mainly because the restriction on it is not as applicable as something like Takedown. So it's in the same event cost, same sort of time you want to play it, but the upside of being able to defeat big vehicle units doesn't really come into play as much as Takedown or even Fell the Dragon's versatility. And you can only play so many of these 4-cost, removal style events, especially when you're playing, let's say, Vigilance or Villainy. You've got Power of the Dark Sides already. You're probably playing Takedowns. You're probably playing Fell the Dragons. You're probably already playing No Glory Only Results. That's a lot of removal events. Putting direct hit in there is part of that removal package potentially, but this one was just not that great because of the lack of versatility. And that's one thing that control decks really, really want. Did it show up in the sideboard early on? Yes, but then as the meta evolved and now we have significantly less space-focused decks to the point where this card isn't really showing up at all, with the exception of occasionally in the sideboard. Next up, we've got a card that I was really excited about in spoiler season. When we saw Clone Combat Squadron, it was after I had actually just started playing Vader. So I had just built the new Vader, the one that generates all the TIE Fighters, It was like, dang, Clone Combat Squadron seems like it's a good fit for this. However, how good is a unit that's just a big fat unit? Like, it, yes, will come down. It's a 3/3/4 cost space unit in command, and it gets +1/+1 for each of the friendly space unit. So yeah, it's going to come down, and in most cases, it's going to be at least be a 4/4 or a 5/5. Invader, though, probably like a 6/6 or even potentially a 7/7 because of how many space units you generate. Turns out that this is one of the key cards in one of the best decks in the format right now. Vader ended up being exceptionally powerful, especially with the tempo advantage you get with Cunning. And then the chain of Clone Combat Squadron into Overwhelming Barrage is so incredibly strong, especially since your opponent needs to deal with all your prior units. Remember, starting the chain of generating a bunch of tokens puts you out of range with a lot of the standard removal. So your opponent needs to have, because takedown probably won't work on Clone Combat Squadron, needs to have something like a Vanquish, needs to have something like a Fell the Dragon in order to finish off Clone Combat Squadron. And that makes it really, really tricky. However, with this, because of Darth Vader's other units like Sanctioner Shuttle, Geonosis Patrol Fighter, you're actually disrupting their board and creating units that your opponent has targets on them. For example, if you Sanctioner Shuttle, you've stolen one of their units. Now, yeah, you can kill the Clone Combat Squadron, but then can you also kill the Sanctioner Shuttle, which is beating you down and preventing your earlier plays? Like, that's the combination. All the disruptive elements make it so that when Clone Combat Squadron does come down in Vader, it's something that your opponent probably doesn't have that many opportunities to actually get rid of it. And then you, as I said, load up an Overwhelming Barrage, and then you've got like an 8, 9, 10 powered Overwhelming Barrage. And again, you get to smack in for 10 points of damage alongside all of your other little tiny hits. And that's usually ending the game either the turn after Clone Combat Squadron comes down or the turn after that when Vader comes down. And you can even put Vader on Clone Combat Squadron, which I've done a lot, and he turns into, 15 power nasty unit with Overwhelming Barrage. It's like a 17 power Overwhelming Barrage. It's incredible. And it's not that crazy, right? Because you only need to have, 5 to 6 to 7 space units, which might seem insane. But remember, when Vader's creating a token every single turn, you're playing a space unit. And then when Vader comes down, you create 2 more space units. It's really not that unlikely. Next one is one that I was really, really high on very, very early into set 4. R2-D2 1 cost ground unit in heroism 1/4. Really, that doesn't matter to me. It's really all about the piloting, because you can pilot it for 0 resource, and you can put it on a vehicle unit without or with a pilot rather, so you don't have to just only put it on vehicles that don't have pilots, because you only have technically 1 pilot on it. You get the ability to put an additional pilot on that unit, and you get +1/+1. Seems pretty, very, very low impact. But the thing I valued from it was that it was basically a free play. What I mean by that is, well, it literally is a free play in terms of 0 resources, but any card such as Bamboozle, R2-D2, Metal Ceremony, these types of cards where, hey, I'm playing a certain style of deck and maybe I'm going a little bit more tempo direction, or maybe I'm going a little bit more aggro focused, you usually can't deploy all the cards in your hand. And having plays that can be played for free is just good. The reality of this situation is it's very, very similar to what we mentioned earlier about something like They Hate That Ship, where if you're deploying this early on, which you do because you want to deploy it first before you get in the attack, you got +1/+1, your opponent's going to have a lot of ways to remove it. That's kind of where the meta is at. Similar to, as I said earlier, with They Hate That Ship. The other thing about this is there's a lot of upgrade hate in the game right now. So even if you are playing this for free, it usually goes ahead and just dies. There was Tarkin Town pretty rampant very early on, and it still is a pretty prominent thing to consider. And yeah, the +1/+1 just doesn't bring it out of that territory. It ends up being not horrible, but just less impressive than I thought. And I was really looking forward to R2 in the more tempo aggro decks, things like Quinlan, things like Sabine, that type of stuff. But those decks went a little bit of a different direction with some of the other cards that eventually came out in set 4. So R2-D2 kind of got pushed to the sidelines, and the pilot thing really didn't work out in terms of going all in on pilots, which is something that, well, R2 is kind of encouraging. With the pilots, as I said, with all the other things that R2's bad against, upgrade hate, removal, the other pilot decks are also really bad against those. And so R2 kind of a weaker play. Now, referring to cards that, well, are pilots and were weak to all the various things I just mentioned, Luke Skywalker is not one of them. 2-cost ground unit in command heroism 3-2, but you can also pilot for 3 for +3/+2. And if this upgrade would be defeated, you may instead move him to the ground arena as a unit and exhaust him. So initially I'm looking at this guy and I'm like, really not that powerful. 2-cost 3-2, it had the force tag, it had the rebel tag, and I did like those. Okay, that's one of the reasons why it ends up being a lot stronger, is the force and rebel tag. So it's like, okay, at least it has that, and it's got this piloting aspect. I think he could be, a reasonable play to make, but not anything super exciting. Like maybe certain decks with piloting synergies or something is going to want to be playing Luke Skywalker. Turns out a lot of decks actually incorporated into their main decks, and a lot of them more still incorporating them into their sideboards, mainly because you can really maneuver this to get you extra damage in the early game if you're trying to be a little bit more aggressive, or just dwarf an opponent's unit and have a really nice value trade. And then if they deal with that unit later on, you still get the Luke unit. And that's the key, especially in the format that we're at now. There's a lot of situations where you're playing this mid-range style of game. Your opponent starts with a space unit, you play a space unit, your opponent then goes ahead and just, maybe they attack with their space unit, maybe they play like a ground unit, and then you go pilot Luke Skywalker onto your space unit. You get to kill their space unit, your space unit lives, and then even if they still deal with that space unit, they have to deal with the Luke as well. And so you got a little bit of a value trade, and your opponent has to deal with that space unit because they can't just get hit for 5 or 6 every single turn the whole game. But they're probably going to get outvalued because this guarantees you some value when that unit dies. And that's the key. Ends up being a lot more interesting. It was less interesting, I will say, when Jango Fett was in the meta, because what would happen is any sort of piloting strategy, you would just get it pinged and then exhausted, and you're like sitting there and you can't even get Luke to the ground arena because they would just exhaust it every single turn. But in the more mid-range style of meta, this has been pretty solid. Of course, especially in games where your opponent's got all sorts of removal options, this is a nice way to, hey, I can push a little bit more extra damage and not get completely blown out should they have an ability to actually defeat my unit that Luke's on. But that's going to wrap up our 10 cards. Some of them very off, and others just overperformed massively to the point where even though I was pretty high on them, they got even higher in my book. But certainly the one that I look back on and is definitely the most wrong one of them all has been They Hate That Ship. Realistically, for set 4, I don't feel like most of our discussions about the cards beforehand were that far off. This is the first set where, unlike set 2 or set 3, where I do feel like there was like 3 or 4 that were completely wrong. In this set, really the one that was big was They Hate That Ship. And the other one's just kind of like massively overperformed, like I mentioned, even though I thought they were good, or a lot of us thought they were good, or just underperformed, even though they still are reasonable. It just wasn't a card that you're auto including in your deck or something like that. So very good stuff with set 4, and my goodness, has the game been extremely diverse. Let me know what your list is in the comments section down below. What cards were you personally wrong about in the coming spoiler season before set 4 released? And I'll see you all for the next one.